This session on open data, Mr. Rupert Simons, Chief Executive of Publish What You Fund, the global campaign for aid transparency. Publish What You Fund works for a world where aid and development information is available, transparent and used for better decision making, for better accountability and for better decisions for everyone. Publish What You Fund works with its partners, Interaction, Development Gateway, the Foundation Center, the Open Data Service and the CGIAR, on the initiative on open data funding, which supports efforts to end hunger and food insecurity by means of providing organization with timely, comprehensive, comparable data. Prior to joining Publish What You Fund, Mr. Simons worked as an advisor to Liberia's President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and also helped to set up Ethiopian Agricultural Transformation Agency. He spent 5 years as a consultant for McKinsey & Company, and he holds degrees in economics and international development from Oxford University and Harvard Kennedy School. The presentation of Mr. Simons would last for 20-25 minutes, and after his colleague, Terwin Davis, from Development Gateway, will provide initial reaction. And after we will open the floor for questions. For anyone who would like to speak or ask any questions, would you please press the button here so we can hear you?
Thank you, Alena. Good afternoon. It's encouraging to see so many people come to a discussion that has the word standard in the title. I know I'm among friends when I can speak to a full room about standards. I hope we don't disappoint. I'll keep this fairly short so we have time for questions, and I apologize in advance that I do need to leave at 4 o'clock sharp. What I'll do in the next 20 minutes is to outline a problem that I think we all face, then consider the case for a results data standard, why this might be a good idea, consider the case against, and conclude with some recommendations on how, whether we have a standard or not, we can all improve data sharing. And I'm glad my colleague Torin from Development Gateway is here to give us some reactions. I've benefited a lot from reading their work on this topic. I should also credit some of the people who helped me review the ideas in this presentation, including but not limited to colleagues from the Open Data Institute, Open Data Services, Aptivate, and the International Aid Transparency Initiative. I didn't check the recommendations with them, so responsibility for those is mine alone. To start off, a little bit about me and Publish What You Fund. We're a transparency campaign. Alena kindly read out our mission statement. The product we're best known for is the Aid Transparency Index. One of the fields in that index is scoring the quality of big donors' results data. So we have an institutional interest in this question. And since we've now been working on agricultural data for almost 2 years, we're also gaining more insight into what agricultural data users might want, going beyond the evaluation community to policy making and accountability communities. And in my previous life as a consultant and as a government advisor, I was a consumer of data. So I would like to think that I can see both sides of the case here. So I wonder if you've ever found yourself in a situation where a program was renewed by funders in spite of an evaluation that said it was ineffective. Or maybe you've worked on the difficult question of capacity building, which is repeatedly found to be almost impossible, but continues to be funded in spite of very little evidence that any of it does much good, although there are exceptions, of course. You might also have wondered why donors have to hire consultants to tell them what everyone else already knows, and in particular, why we still in an age of open data and information sharing have to hire consultants to do a horizon scanning that says, oh, it sounds like you want to do an agricultural development project in Ethiopia. You've been living and working there for a number of years. Nevertheless, let's get some consultants to come in and tell you what everyone else in Ethiopia is already doing about this particular problem. And since we have a lot of professional evaluators in the room, I defer enormously to your expertise, by the way. I wish I had that degree of insight and knowledge into statistical methods and comparative research. Nevertheless, from my limited time working on the academic side of evaluations, did notice that a lot of these fantastic evaluations are not read, in some cases are not even downloaded. When the World Bank did an analysis of their statistics of the downloads, they found only 2/3 of their published papers were downloaded at all. Of course, some might be read online, but anyone who's struggled with the bandwidth in a number of the countries in question will know that even accessing online, let alone reading a 5 or 6 megabyte report, can take several hours. So I've certainly experienced all these problems. Maybe some of you have too. And in many cases, it feels to me like we are collecting data on the same thing, but we're putting it in silos. People don't always remember what silos are. Since this is an agricultural conference, I thought it was only fair to have a picture of a real silo. And silos reflect the way in which professional communities store information. And it doesn't arise out of a desire to be exclusive. It arises from natural professional networks, that aid-funded projects tend to have their own document and data storage facilities. Government-funded projects, an entirely different one. So try finding information on what USAID funds in Ethiopia from the Ethiopian government. You can't get it. Conversely, try finding out what USAID knows about the Ethiopian government's own agricultural development activities, and the answer is very little. There are exceptions, of course, but they're not systematically collected, collated, and stored. Universities and research institutes frequently are a rule unto themselves, even when they're government funded, and private research even more so, and often actually is exclusive by design, because, for example, in seeds and germplasm, there is intellectual property at stake, so it is actively against the interests of the private sector to share this data. Nevertheless, we're all trying to bake bread, and baking bread requires wheat and water and yeast, and depending on the type of bread you want, a whole bunch of other ingredients, and plus an oven, and ideally some other microbes to help you with the fermentation process. So in other words, we do all need data from all of these different silos if we are to bake our development bread. So let's come to the field that I'm most familiar with, which is aid and international development finance. What standards are there for sharing information in this field? Well, we have the International Aid Transparency Initiative. I know that one well because I sit on its board, so I know its limitations as well. There are 550 IATI publishers now. It's been going for about 6 years. And there is data on close to 100,000 activities on there, and 35,000 of those activities have some form of results data associated with them, which sounds great, although in the global scheme of things, perhaps it's still not that many. We also have some emerging data standards in related fields, such as the Open Contracting Data Standard, which for people involved in procurement is a standard for opening and comparing procurement data, which is where a lot of the corruption resides, and therefore is the big prize if you're trying to hunt out fraud, waste, and corruption in the aid industry. There's been a whole bunch of countries testing this standard: Nigeria, Slovakia, Ukraine, and the UK, to name the ones that have admitted to doing so in public. However, great data on contracts does not necessarily add up to aggregated, measurable contractual outcomes. Because what open contracting is really trying to do is see who got the contract, how much did they get paid, and who is the owner of the company behind that contract. It's very difficult to use this standard to assess the outcomes, the results of a contract, because there are so many different kinds of contracts measuring so many different kinds of things. I've also recently become aware of the Statistical Data and Metadata Exchange Standard, SDMX, and this has actually been approved by ISO and is being widely promoted by the UN Stats Commission and Eurostat as a means of exchanging statistical information on things like national income accounts between countries. And you will be unsurprised to learn that the UN Statistics Division is jumping on this as the way to report data on sustainable development goals. The problem is that it doesn't have a results data field as far as I can tell. So it may well be a very good way of tracking and exchanging financing for sustainable development goals, but if we want to exchange information on the results and the achievement of those goals, we're going to have to find it somewhere else. Let's also think about the distinction between data of the results data and the results metadata. Now, I'm not entirely clear on the distinction at times, so I apologize if I'm getting some of this wrong. But my understanding from what I've read is that the results data of evaluations is really about what happened in the program itself. So what were the anticipated outputs and outcomes of the program? What was its theory of change? What actually happened? And what were some of the unanticipated consequences and lessons learned. So this is highly qualitative and often subjective information, and in many cases irreducibly so, because you're trying to measure changes in people's lives. And I learned a lot from the discussions this morning about the different ways of assessing that. Suffice it to say, what impact did program X have on your life is not a question that most people are capable of answering, certainly not objectively. Nor should they be. Metadata on results, on the other hand, should be relatively easy to collate and standardize. Because what we're really talking about here, particularly with formal evaluations, are things like the title of the study that was conducted, the languages in which it was written, the organization or organizations funding it, the implementer, details of the evaluators, if they can be found, the method, so qualitative, RCT, or mixed methods, or any others that you care to enumerate. And you could also, although this immediately becomes controversial, have some kind of grading or ranking. And I saw a very good example of this. Over the lunch break, I was reading through IFAD's own annual report on impact in 2015, produced by the evaluation department here. And they actually had a very nice column chart comparing programs with satisfactory, highly satisfactory, and less satisfactory outcomes. And I was impressed that IFAD feels able to share this sort of information, including the proportion of programs that were evaluated according to that and found to meet that criterion, because a lot of agencies don't feel able to share that, including the UK Department for International Development, which has published details of the approximately 600 internal program assessments that they carry out each year, but they redacted the traffic light scores, which were purporting to give a green, amber, or red flag for that program. Now, some enterprising development researchers crawled through the database and managed to reconstruct the traffic light findings from the narrative of the report. So they hadn't been redacted very successfully. And inevitably when you do that, particularly in an organization such as DFID, which has got a parliamentary committee dedicated to scrutinizing it, and the lively British media, inevitably people started saying, well, it looks like only 60% of DFID programs were scoring green or green amber. How can this be? Because they say they have zero tolerance of failure and risk and waste. So therefore their projects should surely be 100% green or green amber, shouldn't they? And the result of that, of course, is either that DFID panics and stops publishing anything at all, or perhaps more insidiously, that you get a ratchet effect whereby the grades of the there's a grade inflation, so the grades of the programs mysteriously all tend to green or green amber. So if IFAD has managed to resist that temptation, bravo, the Brits have something to learn from you. But not everyone can do this. So that's a risk with being too open about this kind of metadata as well, let alone the risk of taking it out of context. So my conclusion from all of that is that it's a lot easier to standardize the metadata about evaluations than it would be the data on the evaluation itself, and that there would be some utility in doing this in a more shareable form. And if you want to read more on how that might happen, Together with our colleagues at Development Initiatives, we did a working paper on open metadata-based portals, which is not about evaluation specifically, but I've put the link at the bottom of the page. However, drawing on the lessons of the International Aid Transparency Initiative, which I know well, I would argue that we should not create another standard at this time, even another standard that plugs directly into IATI and is interoperable with other standards. And the reasons for that really relate to what Dave Snowden was talking about this morning on complex systems and unintended consequences of complex systems. And I do believe that agricultural development projects meet most of the definitions of a complex system. Not a chaotic one. There are certain predictable rules and regularities, but very far from mechanistic or engineering based. We have seen a dramatic increase in the number of IATI publishers in the past 5 years. There was one in 2011. There are now 550. The majority of them are non-governmental organizations. And that wasn't the original intention. This was meant to be a tool for donors to share information with developing country governments, and to a lesser extent with activists and accountability organizations in aid-dependent countries. But that has not been the outcome at all. There is little or no use of IATI data by developing country governments. A few people are trying. It's very early stage so far. The overwhelming amount of data use is in donors and NGOs sharing information with each other and advertising their programs by setting up open data portals, which unfortunately have the common failing that they tend only to showcase the work of one organization, the organization that sponsored the portal. So this is not necessarily a bad thing. It does help educate us on what these organizations are up to. I have benefited a lot from learning about the activities of some of the smaller UN agencies that I knew very little about from their own open data portals. And some of them look great and are easy to use, but it's very far from the original use case of the IATI standard. And indeed, the IATI Secretariat has acknowledged this, and we as a governing board are trying to figure out if this is something that we have the power to change, or if that's just how it's going to be. So beware the unintended consequence, and be careful not to invest too much in something if you're not confident of the use case. Moreover, I would argue that there is an economy of scale point here, and I learned a lot from the talk by 3IE yesterday afternoon. I first studied evaluation in 2007-8 when the science of RCTs in the development world was in its infancy, and professors who are, Banerjee and Duflo, who've made their name doing this thing, came and lectured my master's degree colleagues on how this was a revolutionary technique that would change all of development thinking. And we have, thanks to the efforts of 3IE and others, we have seen enormous increase in the number of evaluations, including but not limited to RCTs, that are available and searchable on public databases. So 3IE, when I checked last week, had over 4,000 impact evaluations in the database, had over 300 summary reviews. Contrast with Cochrane, which admittedly has been going for longer on medical research, which has over 1 million RCTs and very nearly 10,000 systematic reviews. And as we learned yesterday, those should really be updated every 2 years. And some aspects of medical research may be easier to standardize than international development, but isn't that precisely the point? It's going to be easier to create a results data standard for something like medical research, where RCT is the dominant mode of trial, than in international development, where it may well not be. And let's also just contrast the budget available to these organizations. The US government alone spends 5 times as much on cancer research, so one disease, than all the CG centers in a year spend together. So the orders of magnitude of all of these things would suggest that the costs perhaps do not the costs probably outweigh the benefits of the very substantial investment of time and effort it would take to create a results data standard. Nevertheless, this is not a counsel of despair, and I do believe that there are opportunities to improve data on results and the sharing of that data very substantially, but we have to start by defining the use case. So to whom are we really seeking to help here? Are we trying to improve reporting to donors? This is what IATI is currently very good at doing, gets NGOs to report to donors in a standardized format. Are we really interested in accountability? So given the evident loss of trust by many tax-paying publics in their public institutions, do we seek to re-establish that trust by showing them, look, your money works, here's the evidence for it? Do we aim to improve monitoring and evaluation itself by making more data available, reducing the search costs, as we heard from 3IE yesterday, just automating on machine learning a small aspect of those can save an awful lot of time? Or is our goal really learning and improvement? If you believe in complex systems theory, then arguably learning and improvement is the most important outcome, because since nothing can be forecast or predicted accurately, the best way to advance the science of development is to test lots of things and see what works, and not necessarily generalize from there to the whole world, but at least make sure that that particular approach is not replicated exactly in the same place. So first we have to define the use case. Second, I do think there's a case for being more rigorous about how we publish the metadata in existing standards. And I'm thinking in particular of IATI and open contracting here, because both are due to undergo version upgrades, so-called integer upgrades, in the next year or two. An integer upgrade in the standard is essentially just one that the whole membership needs to sign off on, i.e. it has a political dimension, not a purely technical one. And my suggestion is that the standards bodies and the data users should get together to agree a metadata schema for evaluations and results in aid and development finance. And here I am talking of, above all, the major funders of these evaluations, so looking at organizations like the World Bank, like the UN family, and some of the big bilateral donors, the standards whom they sponsor, but also the people who are using this data, which, at least in the case of formal evaluations, is often those very same organizations who are paying for them, will also be among the biggest users. So this is possible to do. In the meantime, there is absolutely no reason not to publish as much data in open access formats as possible. And this is where the funders, and I would include the private funders like the Gates Foundation in this, do have a role to play. As a minimum, I would suggest that if you're funding or commissioning evaluations on any sort of scale, you should make it mandatory that they be published in open searchable formats, and that's plain text as well as PDF, because not everyone can access download PDFs, and they're not always very searchable. And this is increasingly common in the medical field as well. Researchers should publish the data sets and the code. So if you're working in Stata, publish the do file as well as the underlying data set. There have been some fairly big controversies in development evaluation in the last few years. Deworming is one of the more high-profile ones, in which early publication of the results and the do file might well have taken the sting out of some of the subsequent controversy. And it's important to include studies that don't show significant results. You know, a null result can be as interesting as a positive one. And I think I'm over time, so I should stop there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Rupert, for sharing your experience and insights on challenges of obtaining this world with the transparent and open data. Now I would like to ask Terine to introduce yourself and provide a few insights, and after we'll have maybe 10 minutes for questions.
Thanks. I'll try to be quick. So my name is Taryn Davis. I work with Development Gateway, and we're partners with Publish What You Fund on our initiative for open ag funding. And that is part of where I'm coming from on what I'm going to respond, but also another thing to keep in mind, in my opinion, in what I'm about to say, is also coming from my experience with my colleagues on trying to use results data, where we actually scraped public documents with results data, had to manually put it into a template that matched, and then used algorithms to see, you know, how could we use all this data together? Can we aggregate results data from different organizations? And we found that we could to a certain extent. We can find similar enough indicators in HIV and AIDS that we could add that together to find out how many people have been treated or have received training, how many seeds have been dispersed in Tanzania. So there is that kind of information you can do when you do have this open results data. But I think that more important to that is what the story tells when you can actually start seeing the success versus, you know, the success rate on targets when you are able to run those algorithms and see all those indicators together, which might then lead someone to start reading those evaluation documents. If one organization was really successful while one struggled to see it, it might be more of a prompt to start digging into that evaluation document. However, I don't see, similar as Rupert was saying, a need for another results standard for these documents. The IADI standard does already allow you to upload those evaluations. What I feel like is lacking at this point is an easy way to access that information. And that is something that I hope that we'll be able to take on later this year, as well as really starting to use some of the data that is already in IADI on that results data. While I might kind of push back on against Rupert about saying that publishing results data in a standard format is too big of an ask at this point, I think there are organizations who are moving towards that and more, and I think that can actually be useful because of what we can do in adding that data together to really see who is doing what where. When we did our consultations for the Open Ag project, that was really one of the big things that people kept saying they wanted when we were talking to agriculture specialists. They wanted to know who was doing what where and to what effect. They wanted to know if if someone was really successful, how are they successful? Why were they successful? If someone didn't, they wanted to make sure that they didn't follow those pitfalls. But you first have to show that visual that they were talking in the last session, make it a strong case of why that this didn't work or it did work, and is there a way that we can make that apparent and then make it something that they dig further into, and it probably hopefully should end up in a conversation with someone later, but sometimes you need to have that first data to know who you should be talking to and lead that down to a conversation on the later end. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Taryn. Please, the floor is yours, asking questions. Please.
Thanks, Rupert, for this very informative presentation and for being an advocate for publishing not only our evaluations but also the data sets and code of what's behind the evaluation. So that's really for me the takeaway from your talk today, because as you may be aware, sorry, I should introduce myself, Tina Tojmanebe from UNICEF's Evaluation Office. As you may be aware, the UN Evaluation Group has as one of its standards that all evaluations should be made public, and as far as I can see, across at least the 46 agencies that make up UNEG, this is pretty much now standard and respected. But what we don't do is publish data sets and code. We don't publish any type of interview notes or coding frames for qualitative analysis and so forth. So that may then lead to the, to my mind, a little bit odd perception that you have of evaluation, and probably other people share, that evaluations are somehow subjective, right? So in fact, that is not the ambition in the profession. We're trying to triangulate data, subjective or let's say qualitative or interview data being maybe one source, but we're trying to triangulate and precisely get away from the subjective and get into findings that are robust and that are based on various sources of evidence. So that's a really important point, I think, that I will bring back to my organization, certainly, and also into UNEG. I wanted to make a comment of something that could be added also to your ask here, which is that also management responses to evaluations should be made public. That is something, I'm not sure if it's in the UNEG standards, but it's certainly something that is not happening across the board. But for reasons of transparency and accountability, of course, we would like to know what organizations are actually doing as a response to evaluations. Thank you.
So would you like to answer, or we can collect a few more questions? Please.
My name is Todd Dmitrov. I'm the head of the Independent Evaluation Office of the Black Sea Trade and Development Bank. I just would like to comment on the idea to have more transparency and more publishing. We are working in this direction within the group of the multilateral development banks. There are standards regarding this, but there is also limitation being a lender to the private sector, especially for non-aggregated data. We cannot disclose data regarding specific loans. And even when we can, by anonymizing them, this is very time-consuming and difficult, and the actual benefit is not very clear. I would like also to comment on the success rate that is published by some and not published by others. This seems to be a controversial issue, because once it gets published, and we do publish our successfully rated operations every year in our annual report, then the board immediately asks questions: how do we compare with others? And actually one of our targets is to give certain degree of freedom for failure, or certain room for a safe learning environment, as we called it. And the target so far is 70% success rate to have, and we do have this. And I think this is an argument one should consider.
Please.
Yeah, I just would comment. I'm Cheryl Gray, the director of the Evaluation Office at the Inter-American Development Bank, and prior to that, 25 years at the World Bank, including head of evaluation for the World Bank part. So I'm very familiar with the multilateral development banks, and I just wanted to comment a little bit on the different example you gave. I see it all very much around the question of governance, and the evaluators know what they're doing. They do a good job. They can easily tell the truth, and generally the methods are pretty good, and the data collection and the evaluation. Whether or not they can actually say the truth and whether they can publish the truth is a very political issue. And my experience, but I'd love to hear other people's, bilaterals have real trouble with that because of the politics. It's very, very hard for a governing political party to let people publish failure because, exactly as you said, the media and the opposition gets hold of this and presses it. We even did an evaluation of a Japanese trust fund in the World Bank, and the Japanese government went crazy, and this was the Japanese government, that we would possibly publish something that wasn't perfect about their trust fund. And this was Japan, which was really a surprise to me. They were absolutely pushed back every bit as much as, a developing country would. But I would like to advertise a little bit. I'm not sure people realize that we have what I think of is a kind of a gold standard, although it's always fragile, in the multilateral development banks. And it's in this group that's going to meet tomorrow and the next day of independent evaluation offices. I mean, I was appointed by the board. Management would have fired me a long time if they could have, but it's very clear they can't. I have fixed terms. I have an independent budget. I have a mandate to publish everything we do. I can never work for the organization in any capacity after I leave. I hire all the staff. I mean, it is a very important model of independent evaluation that is somewhat fragile. Because as I say, management would have pushed it out a long time ago, not only in my organization, but I think all of the multilateral organizations. Because the natural instinct, of course, in management, they want to publish all the great things they're doing. They don't want to publish the dirty laundry. And we do publish the dirty laundry. I invite any of you to look at the websites, certainly of IDB and the World Bank, which I know the best, but I think ADB and the other groups as well. We have very hard-hitting evaluations on those websites, and they are public. And also, the World Bank is amazing. For the last 25 years, they've done an honest evaluation of every project ever funded, and done by a self-evaluation and validated by the Independent Evaluation Office. And the final findings of that independent office are on the website for every single project that's been funded. And the incentives are such that there actually are incentives to tell the truth. So anyway, I just wanted to recognize that it's really about governance. I think this independent model works fairly well. Nothing's perfect. But I also think it's very fragile. So I would, if I were you, I would just recommend think about, and especially you were a governance advisor, the deep underlying incentives here and see if there's any way we can change that. Possibly by making bilateral evaluation agencies more independent as well, although I'm not sure the UK example is particularly optimistic there. So anyway, just a thought. Thank you.
Would you like to comment, Rupert?
Yes, I'll respond to that last point first, if I may, and then come back to some of the others. So I do think there's a lot to be learned from the independent model that the World Bank and the IADB and others have operated for a long time. I used to be an enthusiastic reader of World Bank IEG reports, particularly those pertaining to countries in which I was working. You always learned something, and the program officers in country didn't always read them. I do think there's something to be learned from the experience of those bilateral donors who have tried to make their own evaluation functions a little bit more independent. So taking the most obvious one first, Germany has the German Institute for Evaluation, which looks at the programs of BMZ-funded activities, so including the major implementers, GIZ and KfW. And I don't know to what extent that has changed the conversation, but I think the fact that that stands outside either of the implementers and has its own budget line is an important step. And since it looks like we're going to have to rely on Germany as the biggest bilateral European donor in the future, I think this is an example that we need to be studying closely. The UK is perhaps a little further along in this respect. As you say, it's a mixed experience. On the one hand, there's DFID's own internal assessment of programs, which is what gave rise to the 600 self-assessments report that DFID tried to redact, but then realized was going to be public anyway and produced this ratchet effect. On the other hand, I think the Independent Commission on Aid Impact has so far resisted the pressure to ratchet up the number of green and amber green traffic lights, or the pressure for grade inflation. But we all know that pressure is quite hard to resist. It'll be interesting to see if DFID still exists on Friday. If it does, then I would argue that that represents a partial win for the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, because it is helping buttress the case for an independent DFID. If DFID is merged with the Foreign Office or the International Trade Department, as a number of us fear, then I think we have to go back to the drawing board, because it's increasingly apparent that our political leaders don't respond to evidence apart from, we knew that, right? But in more dramatic ways than had perhaps been feared. Now, the real unknown for me is the European Commission. Immediately after this session, I'm going to Brussels for the European Development Days. The EU Commission has just announced a new European consensus for development, which pays lip service to all the right things. So development effectiveness principles, independent evaluation, evidence, rigor, and so on. However, the institutional setup of the Commission is not favorable to implementing those practices inside the Commission. It is typically left to the European Parliament to do that. Unfortunately, a lot of European countries, and I realize Italy is a partial exception to this, do treat the elections to the European Parliament as a way of settling domestic scores rather than as a serious way to attempt to influence the governance of European institutions. So the Parliament, the Development Committee in the Parliament tries its best, but it is not, with the best will in the world, going to be providing the level of external scrutiny that an independent evaluation group or its equivalent would. And I do think that if we're going to see progress on this, it's going to have to come at the European level, because it's fairly clearly not going to come out of London or Washington, D.C. Now let me come to your point on private sector. One of the arguments that I often hear made for blended finance is that there is greater impact from private sector lending than public. And to date, I see very little evidence for that view. I'm personally sympathetic to it because I've worked in countries that welcome private investment and countries that don't, and I've seen the difference. But I think we need to be a lot more careful in bringing evidence to bear on this proposition, because under what circumstances using public money to blend with private, and what modes of private investment are most effective, whether we're talking about equity or debt or some combination of the two, and with what size of investee, and should you invest primarily in the financial sector, as the IFC does, or primarily in functional businesses, as US OPIC does. These, I think, are all incredibly important questions, and for whatever reason, we're not getting good systematic answers to them. And I would argue that part of the reason for that is that we've allowed commercial confidentiality to go too far, in that we're systematically excluding whole sectors of the development field from analysis because of commercial confidentiality, rather than saying, okay, what is genuinely causing us a legal problem if we publish versus what is just inconvenient. And I apologize, I don't know the details of your bank, so I don't know to what extent you do this. But in discussion with the IFC, I know very well it's been difficult for them to get around to publishing IATI data and to dealing with the commercial confidentiality exemptions. And it's difficult for the private sector windows of the African Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank to do that too. But they are figuring it out. And I think we need to come back to this in a year or two and make a much more systematic attempt to capture the impact of public and private lending when these are being blended. And maybe that will happen through open data standards for the public sector like IATI, or maybe we have to create a new one for private finance. I'm not sure, but I hope we can work with the DFIs on that, because clearly there's a lot of impact in the DFI work that is being imperfectly accounted for. Lastly, I would just second your point on management responses. I worry that the management responses will be redacted and have their teeth taken out if they're made too public, but they're an important part of the ecosystem. And if you really do need to terminate a program, I think it's better to admit that and to be honest about the reasons for doing so than to carry on pretending that everything's fine and then wonder why the public has lost trust in the institutions of development cooperation.
So thank you very much, everyone, for attending this session. And thank you, Rupert, for this wonderful presentation and discussion, and Sylvine as well.